Welcome to Emerging Excellence, and it is our pleasure to welcome Simon Kuestenmacher to the show again. Simon, you've been on here before. First of all, welcome. Thanks so much for taking the time out to speak to us.
Absolute pleasure.
And I'm glad you got the white shirt memo, which is excellent. It wasn't necessary, but it's a good one for a hot day, which I think is 42 down in Melbourne today. So thanks for, I'm sure you got the air conditioning blaring in the background. And for those who don't know Simon briefly, you're a demographer and you're the co-founder of the Demographics Group. And you speak all across Australia on all things population and all things kind of what's happening and how our city's changing. And I can't think of anyone actually better to touch on this topic today in terms of this infrastructure boom, which is happening in Queensland, but it's also happening nationally. And we've got these really interesting bottlenecks, these market dynamics, these governments craving infrastructure spend and kind of infrastructure across the country, but they're running into the people problem, which is we just don't have enough people. So Simon, you can do a much better job of set the scene for us. What's the nature of this, especially in this kind of Queensland area? How bad is it from your perspective? And is there any reprieve, I guess, is an interesting question to start with.
Yeah, well, so to roll back time a bit, let's go to roughly the Sydney Olympics, so 2000 onwards. We didn't build enough infrastructure. We allowed infrastructure to develop at a much lower pace than we added population on top of the country. And so we now come into the situation, we got an infrastructure backlog. It depends on which specific geography you talk about and who you talk about, but roughly 20 years of infrastructure backlog is what we have in this country. So that is problematic. Along comes the pandemic. During the early years of the pandemic, we were not quite sure how much industries would die off because of the pandemic, how much would recover. And so governments realized, let's stimulate the economy by building infrastructure. We've always done this. This is pretty much a tried and proven idea. And so we'd write all of those infrastructure projects into our state and federal budgets that we're willing to pay for. And so all of a sudden, we got really happy for a little bit. We go, wow, finally, we're waking up to catching up on the infrastructure backlog. Great stuff. Quite quickly, we realized, wait a second, if we build infrastructure, we take a workforce away from the ever worsening housing crisis. We take workers away from the residential construction sector. So that's problematic. Also, inflation, because we spent so much money during the pandemic and bigger macro drivers across the world, inflation gets worse and worse. We realize, oh no, adding infrastructure is inflationary. So all of a sudden, we are now moving backwards and we go, what could we do in order to slow down the infrastructure spend? So we're not inflationary and we don't take too many workers away from the residential sector. Problematic. On top of this, of course, if we're going back, 2-3 years. If you do what I do on a Saturday night and you line up, you download all these state and federal budgets, you scroll down to the infrastructure page, you just have to giggle manically because you realize it can't possibly all be built. There is not enough workers in the country to possibly do this. So you go, something has to give. And we're now scaling back those projects to a certain degree. We go, we do what South Australia has done, and they put a pause on the infrastructure for it was meant to be 6 months, turned out to be a bit longer. But they essentially said, let's not do anything rash. Let's think about what actually is the most important stuff, and then we focus on that. And we are, in a sense, now doing this a bit more. We're a bit more cautious in what infrastructure needs to be developed. That also points to the problem, though, that infrastructure largely is a state-by-state issue, and we're not coordinating between those states. So theoretically, a big body like Infrastructure Australia could exist, and they could be handed over a lot of power to have a bit of a organizing function, because this way we would depoliticize infrastructure. Infrastructure is quite often used as a political tool to promise a nice thing, a bridge, a tunnel, a stadium, whatever it is, to a certain votership. Well, that's fine in a sense if this was be built. But then the next government comes along and says, well, that's a stupid tunnel. Let's not build it. And so we're burning millions, if not billions of dollars on just like half-built infrastructure. If we had a coordinating body like Infrastructure Australia, they could at least say, this is the most important stuff, we're building this. And the politicians, they don't get to decide what is being built. They only get to decide the size of the bucket of the infrastructure spend. And they could always then point the fingers to Infrastructure Australia and say, we would have loved to build this thing for you, dear voters, but those evil technocrats, they're not allowing me to do this wonderful thing. But so we don't have this. And so there is this big competition for infrastructure. Everyone wants to build now. We're now scaling back. And you hinted at it at the introduction. We're now facing bottlenecks, meaning we don't have enough workers per se as a workforce as a whole. But most importantly, there's certain kind of bottleneck jobs. And we talk about civil construction here. This always flies under the radar in the news because we talk about houses, and you live in a house, so that's much more important for you. But before you build a new estate, somebody needs to bulldoze land, somebody needs to put a couple of pipes and a bit of wires. You build a road, that's civil construction, and that's who's doing that. It's not sexy, it's not visible, and there are a couple of jobs in the civil construction universe where the skills shortage is absolutely comical. We're talking about all these kind of jobs that have the word machine operator associated with it. So something like a earth removal plant operator. There are none of them around. And the existing workers are very heavily geared towards the 50s. So meaning in a decade, they'll all be retired. So there are brutal bottlenecks here. You can say, yes, let's pay for the TAFE degrees that we create more. Fair enough. Let's import workers from overseas. Fair enough. But you see, one of those solutions has a serious educational reform smell. The other one is a immigration reform that we talk about. So they are interconnected, complex, and very difficult and highly politicized issues that need to be solved just in order to make sure that we have enough roads being built in the future. And we don't realize it because it's not all that obvious, but the data shows those job bottlenecks very, very clearly.
I want to touch on, let's come back to just Queensland. I think we'll come back to the Australian landscape and the politicisation in a moment, especially with the federal election on the horizon, albeit hasn't been called yet. So in terms of Queensland, I know, the government came out just last week talking about, look, the Labor government, they overspent the budget. It's crazy. We're not going to do this. And it's worse than what we thought. There's all of that kind of, it seems like posturing before their 100-day review comes back and potentially, say, we're going to cut this project, cut that project. Tell me, why are you so bullish that Southeast Queensland is actually going to get the infrastructure it needs, especially compared to other states, and perhaps that the demand is going to stay higher than it might even seem logical to in this neck of the woods?
Yeah, so the Queensland special ace up their sleeve is, of course, the Olympic Games. So you do have a absolutely epoch-shaping event only 7 years out now, 7.5 years out now. So it's very, very close. And the Games, of course, just a quick reminder why we have the Olympic Games is not because we love sports, which we do. It is the Council of Mayors in Queensland came together and said, let's grab the Olympic Games because the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, they changed their rules. You now need to not provide as much new sporting infrastructure as it was in the past. So you can build a budget games, and all the new money that we take into our hands, we actually use this to put infrastructure in place. And the infrastructure is largely meant to improve the connectivity between the individual hubs of Southeast Queensland. So we're talking about the connectivity from the Gold Coast to Brisbane to the Sunshine Coast and even out west to a degree as far as Toowoomba even. And so we go, that's really cool. If we get this right, Southeast Queensland will become the single best connected city in Australia. And I'm not of course, the Tom Tates of the world don't want to hear this, but I don't view Southeast Queensland as several cities. I view it as one functioning conurbation, one urban beast, because people move wherever they want within this area and commute to whatever area they use facilities, infrastructure across the area. And if you view Southeast Queensland as a city, it is the second largest city in Australia, and this is the third largest city, sorry, and it is the best connected. It has 3 different CBDs. It has 3 different international airports. It has a big regional airport out west. No other city compares. But of course, we need to improve the connectivity between those hubs. We're doing this. The infrastructure plans are theoretically geared towards that. So we take future money, throw it at Southeast Queensland, we improve the connectivity. It's the best connected city in the country. So far, the theory. The practice, of course, is that, well, if the devil's in the detail, you go, well, should this tram road go here? Should it go there? Is it a fast rail? Is it a light rail? All of those discussions are always very, very emotional on the ground level. I, of course, as a demographer, I'm always zooming out. I don't care about any of those details. Does the tram go left or right? Pros and cons for each argument, I'm always assuming. But the idea is, if you get the connectivity between those different hubs right, you are providing a city that can afford growth, that can provide housing, more affordable housing for more people. Ultimately, it will become a more desirable city if you build the infrastructure. And now the clock is ticking, because you'll only get the money for the infrastructure if you can guarantee that the particular project is up and running the day of the opening ceremony. That is in 7.5 years. So that means you have maybe 3 years max to get those projects shovel ready.
In terms of the people part, yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it, right? Because if you look at the people part, I was reading the Infrastructure Australia report, which they updated. I can't believe they released it on the 23rd of December last year. Like, what a day to release anything. Yeah. It was almost like they didn't want you to see it, perhaps. But it's interesting reading, because the workforce in Australia, as if I quote their figures, is 198,000 people currently in construction nationally. And the shortage of people is 197,000 people nationally. And so in order to bring this pipeline of work together on a national basis, you need a second workforce. And so I feel like what you're saying, though, Queensland is going to be higher up because we've got that, basically they've got the business case for it, or kind of justifiable piece. Yeah. How, if you're sat there in command of a workforce, Simon, at the moment, and thinking about, I've put all these bids in, I'm waiting for them to come back through, should you have hope that the staff are just going to be there, or how do you think about that gaping hole, that kind of maybe that uncertainty piece? So for any major business leader, CEO, upper manager who's listening to this, your single biggest concern in the coming decade will be your workforce. That's it. Hiring will be incredibly difficult. That means that all those buzzwords that are being thrown around, AI, automation, robots, these are your friends. This is your fighting chance to get your existing workforce to become a bit more efficient, so to speak. But it's hard. It's going to be very, very hard. You can always lobby as an industry body, as a big CEO, for reform. We should, for example, make sure that we get much more construction workers imported through the skilled migration scheme. Absolutely crucial. That is the stuff that we need to do. We need to build our way out of this crisis. Yes, we need to also create need to reform the educational system. Remember that Australia is a super simple country. We do not run a complicated business. We do 4 things, and 4 things only: mining, agriculture, tourism, international education. That's all we do in this country. There's nothing else that matters to the rest of the world. That's absolutely all we do. So does this workforce that services those 4 sectors, do they need to make sure that half of our year 12 cohort goes to university?
That's what's happening at the moment. We are
Mm.
over-educating our country. And of course, we're never over-educating. As a human, you're never over-educated. You and I, everyone listening, we're all too dumb. We don't read enough. We don't think enough. We have that in common. But we don't need to all go to uni. Half of us don't need to go to university. So we should probably tighten the university system, make it more exclusive, so to speak, harder to get in. And we, at the same time, while we make unis harder to get in, still give a pay premium to university degrees, so you have an incentive to go there. We need to lower the barriers of entry to TAFE level type work. So I'm very, very sure that by the end of the decade, TAFE will be universally free. It's dumb that we charge money for a TAFE degree. It's almost criminal because we give you a pay premium for a TAFE job, but not that much. So don't put a hurdle up front. Don't disincentivize people to go there. We are already getting rid of this hurdle in a piecemeal fashion. There's always a government that says, 10,000 nursing degrees or whatever, 100 carpenters for free. We're handing them out in piecemeal. That's stupid. Let's make it universally free. That will happen. But that's structural long-term change. You still need years to create an entry-level worker. And if you run your own business, an entry-level worker is fine. They do their stuff, but ultimately the sweet spot is a worker who has 10 plus years of experience. These are workers you can trust. These are workers that know, their way around the tools. That's the most desirable worker that you do want to hire. A bit more expensive, but ultimately, who cares? And so, we're facing long-term issues here. And in the short term, I want you to be very, very serious about looking at your operations and think about, where can I take work away from my workforce? Am I forcing them to do too much boring paperwork? Can I minimize this? Can I automate the paperwork? That might free up an hour or two of a worker per week. Doesn't sound like much, but over a year, over a workforce, that creates quite a bit of efficiencies. So that's the type of thinking that I would argue the most successful businesses of the future will actually implement right now, because it's doable. You have a lot of boring, nonsensical tasks. If you manage your calendars better, your projects, your just your timetables better, you can get productivity out of a workforce that currently you're wasting. Look at this with a very critical eye, and you become a more successful, more profitable business.
Interesting. And I think that's interesting because there is, when you go through the data from Infrastructure Australia, there is no silver bullet here. There's no kind of golden chariot. So they're coming to the rescue. It's even migration appears to be like 10% pretty much of the kind of future years. It doesn't solve the situation. In fact, there is no solution coming. And it was kind of scary how much the Infrastructure Australia report didn't really touch on solutions.
And of course, you do reach issues that we are not talking about. It's just the way that we build our cities. Our cities, on average, have a population density that is about 4 times lower than an equally sized European city. So that means the average Australian needs 4 times as many kilometers of rail, of road, of electricity lines, of pipage for your sewage. That's a lot. And so you go, well, cool, no problem. Let's just look at what all those planning strategies from our big cities have. They all talk about minimize urban sprawl. We need to build up, not out. Makes sense, because then we do need to not build that much infrastructure. That's very desirable. Then we slowly rein in the sprawl, the amount of infrastructure. Great. That all says we need to live in higher density dwellings. Sometimes people say Australians don't want to live in these dwellings. Let's ignore this for now. Let's just say we can theoretically build apartments that are large enough, that are attractive enough for people to live in. The problem is that right now, building a square meter of apartment costs about 3 times the amount of money than to build a square meter of a separate house on a greenfield site, in Logan or God knows where. And so, well, guess what we're going to build? It's not economically feasible to build all of those apartments. The top end of the market is fine. They build apartments. If you look at downsizer luxury apartments, cool, you can get them. But if you want to house new Australians, and we're adding about 400,000 people, just under that actually, to Australia each year. Let's call it 350,000. But that's really what we do need to build. And we're not doing this at scale. And so we then need infrastructure. And we're back to the idea of, well, who's building this infrastructure thing? We're not getting anywhere at the moment with those discussions, because it does take a radical rethink of what to do. You can talk about, yes, a bit of an incentive from a tax way, incentivize more landlords to buy housing, to build housing, whatever. We're still not really talking about scale here. And so I would not predict this to get much better in the coming decade. In about 12, 15 years, you have a lot of baby boomers dying out of their homes. So all of a sudden, that means a lot of housing stock becomes available that has downward pressure on house prices. Then people move into the middle suburbs where the baby boomers die out of. And then things get a bit better, so to speak. Not if you die, but for all the survivors, things do get better then. But in the next 10, 15 years, it's same old, unless we make radical changes.
Interesting. Let's talk about the political side of things. We got a federal election on the horizon. In fact, I was talking to a general manager late last week, and they're kind of a little bit nervous about what's going on. And I'm curious from your perspective about immigration is a big topic. It certainly was massive in the US, and certainly off the back of that Trump election. What do you think is going to happen here? Dutton's starting to spruik some of that similar language, so around kind of, it's too busy, they're overrun here. What's your kind of take on whether actually maybe there's going to be future bottlenecks with a change to immigration?
Yeah, so migration will be a big topic. There will also be a change in government. I'm very, very certain about this, simply because all major economies changed government. This is, of course, not an election that is favoring the incumbent. Makes sense. You have inflation, you have cost of living, you have an unhappy population. You go, might as well kick the old team out. And we'll have that here. On top of that, of course, there's the beautiful demographic statistic that in Australia, statistically speaking, you become prime minister at 54, and Peter Dutton turned 54 in November. So I'm very certain that will also play in. But so let's assume Peter Dutton will become prime minister. Tough talk about cutting migration so far. I would say ignore him. Don't listen to him here. Simply because the last time that the Liberals became the leading party, they talked very tough about cutting migration by 50,000 people per year. Every year they were in power, saw the highest migration intake on record. Talk is cheap in politics. And it gets you votes. And it's always done in the very... We always say, yes, we celebrate the migrants, but this is a cost of living crisis. This is a housing affordability crisis. It's mad to take in as many people as we've done in the last year or so. And that's true. In the last year, we saw the highest ever migration intake. And so you go, that's mad. That does seem, it's an uncouth look, so to speak. But I'd always say, stay cool, calm, and collected. Look at the migration intake since the pandemic and average it out. On average, we took in fewer migrants than in the equal time period before the pandemic. What happened in the last year and a half is that we took in 3.5 years worth of international students. And then you end up with this massive intake of migrants in 1 year. And so any government that will be in power next year or year and a half after that can say we significantly cut down migration. Each government, whatever it will be, will take in about 230, 240,000 net new migrants each year. I'm absolutely certain. At the very least, I can guarantee you that we'll reach this standard average number because the treasurer will not allow the prime minister to cut migration. This is a country where about 54% of all the tax that we earn as a country is income tax. Migrants are all super juicy, high income taxpayers. It doesn't add up. So we positioned ourselves into a system where we need this. Unless there is major wealth reform, a wealth taxation reform, you can't cut migration. But if you go back to the long-term median of 240,000 migrants per year, you all of a sudden can say, well, we are now only taking in a third of the migrants that we took in last year because it was the stupid outlier thing. Disregard any talk about migration. The only interesting stuff is what share of our migrants in total numbers, because we only ever talk about the total numbers, how should we allocate them? Should we shrink down international students and then, of course, rob ourselves of a massive source of income and then take in more construction workers, for example, civil construction workers? I say that is probably helpful, but if we take out just a single international student, we need to subsidize the university system by about $30,000. So, if we say we want to take out 100,000 international students, all of a sudden this becomes quite pricey. It's actually only $350 or something like this per taxpayer. But then you can ask voters, hey, do you think it's a good deal? You pay $1 a day, more or less, to make sure that we have fewer migrants. But then it's up for the Australians to decide if this is a good deal or not. These are the real discussions that need to be had. And it's, I'd say stay cool, calm, and collected. You can plan with migration as customers, as workers in the future. There will not be a major cut to migration. End of story.
Let's touch on young people. Our focus as a business is all about first-time leaders, and specifically those, typically, I'd say anywhere between 25 and 45, who are kind of coming through their technically trained, so usually engineers, construction, something like that, maybe on the tools as well, so maybe a supervisor, and they're coming up into this, what can only be considered a huge boom, right? There's opportunity everywhere, and there's going to be an opportunity to work on, if you're in Southeast Queensland in particular, you might get to work on the new Olympic Stadium, you might get to work on, the Olympic Village, you might get to work on these really sexy projects, which, and you could you could be part of that future for the country. So quite an exciting time. What do you think, how would they best be preparing for this, Simon, given that there is going to be a skill shortage? It feels like that a well-prepared, a well-positioned person with the right skills actually could have the pick of the crop. That would be my take on it, but that's a very, I think, perspective. But I don't know, what's your take?
No, that's exactly it. If there's a skill shortage, it means that the existing people in that particular field can increase prices. It's the flight to quality. There's certain kind of problems here if we talk about infrastructure. Let's talk about residential housing. That's almost a bit more easy to understand. We don't have enough developers to build housing. We have a skills shortage at the top end of the market, multi-million-dollar luxury housing. We don't have enough median-priced housing, and we don't have enough affordable emergency-type social housing. So the profits are high at one end and low at the other end. So where will you position yourself and your business, especially in a sector where margins are not that high? Because, well, of course, I go to the top. And so everyone goes to the top, and the bottom end of the market doesn't even get serviced. So infrastructure is a bit different, because who pays for infrastructure? Well, who can always pay for infrastructure is the state. And so this is where the infrastructure workers, they all then go to the big state projects, and they get built in the most inefficient ways possible, potentially. But who cares? If you are on the job, you get good money out of it. And so you park yourself there. The risk, of course, is that you go, well, maybe those projects get canceled. Maybe there's a change of government, but ultimately you will fall very softly, because you can be assured that there will be a land lease, whoever will buy your services for their infrastructure needs as well. So yes, the important thing is take a pick, run an efficient business, run a lean and mean operation, try to utilize your workers in the most efficient way, because then you can really double down on your success. But that also means that you need to do things differently. If your business runs the same way than the business runs of a guy who's been in the business for 30, 40 years, you're probably not doing it right. You're probably leaving a lot of efficiencies on the table, so to speak. And lots of this is project management. Where do you allocate your workers? How do you time those things? How do you make sure that your workers spend as little time as possible in a car? There's nothing worse than a tradie in a car, because that's where they are technically working, but they're not adding anything. Yeah? And so this is when in construction, we sometimes talk about the importance of or the chances that we could have with modular homes, with factory built housing, because we say, well, tradies, they aren't traveling. They're under a roof, no bad weather. They can be very efficient. Every minute of their time is spent on the tools rather than in the ute. That's better if we were able to set it up in the right way. And so, infrastructure a bit harder to do, because you can't easily rethink this in a modular fashion. Maybe you can. Maybe I'm just not knowledgeable enough there. But there is the potential for real game change in the whole construction and even civil infrastructure world, I would say, that we haven't done yet. Because so far, people paid for things being done in the old way. Yes, we have cool research bodies here that think about how can we, asphalt research. How can we use better asphalt? How can we build roads faster, better, longer lasting, cheaper to maintain? All of those things are important, but ultimately infrastructure always gets forgotten in those equations, because who pays for infrastructure? It always feels like nobody ever pays for it, because you pay for your house, you pay for whatever, and the infrastructure costs, they're just somewhere in the background. And so that's never front of mind. And so innovation there doesn't get focused on as much as it should be, I guess.
And I think, so what you're saying, up and coming leaders is start to prepare or be prepared to be working in an environment which is going to see an increase in automation, AI. You mentioned robots. Like you can see with this, they're going to have no choice, right, to start to look at these efficiencies, or maybe you're saying maybe they do have a choice because governments are just going to pay regardless. But what you're saying is that companies are going to have to move towards, and so the people in that workforce who are savvy in that way are going to be well prepared for the future, whatever
and those moves can be very scary at times because they're capital intensive. And it always feels like that there is a future boom coming. And so I'd rather wait with my investment than do it now. So if you think about traffic management, a lollipop person comes at a high labor cost per hour, but ultimately, it's easy to set up, no problem. There are electronic lighting systems that can do this as well, but they come with a super high upfront cost. If you plan long enough, that ultimately becomes cheaper at some point. But you go, can I finance this? Can I pay for this? You go, high interest rates. That's something that scares people from investments. I'd say, structurally speaking, interest rates want to be higher in the future rather than lower. So now might be a good investment time. And what I mean by this is that over the last decades, there was cheap money available because interest rates were low. But why were interest rates low? Well, because you had so much capital that was held by baby boomers when they were young. And then when you're young, your financial advisor tells you, spend on high risk, high reward type investments. And the older you get, the more conservative you are meant to be. And so now the global capital stock ages, and we want risk averse capital. So there's fewer high interest, high yield future success things out there. So interest rates will stay slightly elevated as we get older. Who cares about this in the long run? I'd say don't bet. I guess what I'm saying is do not bet on a super low interest rate environment in the future. Think that now is the new normal. I'm not saying there will not be a rate cut here or there, but ultimately you're facing a decade of higher rather than lower interest rates. So your investments, if you know that you need to make them in the future, might as well make them now. And eat up a tiny bit more market share now, because this country keeps growing. We're still adding 350,000 people per year. These people need to be housed. These people consume infrastructure in one way or another. You are in a field that will continue to grow. It's lots of things work in your favor. It's just the labor piece that you need to get right. And once you get this right, the world's your oyster.
Great place to leave it. Simon, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. It's been awesome talking to you.
It's been an absolute pleasure.